Okay, hi. Now in this video we're going to have a look at synapses and then we're going to take a quick look at the reflex arc. Now I've done this in the reverse order than you see in your book because I think it actually makes more sense to understand what a synapse is to begin with. Now in the last video we spoke about the neurons and we spoke about the different kinds of neurons, so sensory, relay and motor. Now what's important is that these neurons are joined together because they need to pass the signal one to the other. And how is this achieved? Well, let's say for example we had two neurons like this. You would actually have them joined up one end to the other. And this here is how they are joined. There we go. And what this is known as a synapse. So the synapse is basically the junction between two neurons. But let's take a look in slightly more detail. If we zoomed in, you would have a synapse which looks like this. So here's the junction. You've got this occurring, and then on the other side, something like that. Now this gap here is this gap here. So you have the neuron ending here, and then the next neuron beginning, which is here. And what's important is that we have a gap in between. Now the electrical impulse cannot pass this gap. So the impulse cannot pass the gap, so we need another way for it to pass along to the next neuron. So our electrical impulse is traveling down this way, and then it encounters this gap. Now what happens is that this part of the neuron here contains sacs which have in them chemicals. So chemicals which are then going to be released. Now these chemicals are actually known as neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters. And that is because they transmit the signal from one neuron to another. So neurotransmitters, and they are going to be released into this here, which is known as the gap or the synaptic cleft, if you like. So released into here, and the chemicals, like that, will then eventually hit this new neuron. And this neuron will have special receptors, which I'm just drawing here. So special receptors, which will detect the chemical. They detect the neurotransmitter, and they convert the chemical into another electrical impulse. So they convert it into another impulse, and then the impulse can carry on traveling, and we have therefore bridged this gap. So the electrical impulse is converted into a chemical, which is released. The chemical is then converted into an electrical impulse, and that carries on. If you wanted this in more detail, we of course can't convert a chemical into an electrical impulse because the chemical can't just be deleted, if you like. But the movement of the chemical and the detecting of the chemical over here causes another reaction which will create an electrical impulse. And then this chemical is recycled and it's used over and over and over again, and this happens over and over and over again. Okay, great. So let's move on now to a reflex. So what a reflex is a subconscious reaction to stimuli. So whereas in the previous video we saw how we respond to stimuli consciously, a reflex allows us to do that subconsciously. An example of something which is controlled by reflexes is our gut. So our gut will work and move food through our digestive system without us doing it consciously. Our breathing is also subconscious as well because we don't have to always remember to breathe. So they are very important because they allow very fast response. Another example is if you've ever touched something which is really hot, your hand just shoots away from it and you don't actually have time to register that it's hot until your hand has already moved. And so you don't put your hand, let's say, in a cup of boiling water. I don't know why you would do that anyway, but let's say for example you did. You wouldn't put your hand in boiling water, realise it hurt, and then move your hand away, because by then you've already been burned. So if you touch it, your hand will shoot away from it, and that is a reflex. Your brain will still know that it's hot, but it'll only register it after your hand has already moved. And the reason for that is that a reflex arc will bypass, so reflexes bypass the conscious part of the brain. They still involve the CNS, but they will bypass the conscious part of the brain in order to elicit a response. Now, how does this happen? Well, it's actually down to the type of neuron that we mentioned in the last video, known as a relay neuron. So let's say we had this guy, and he touched a cup of boiling hot water. So this cup is boiling hot. Okay, so that's really going to hurt. And he's probably going to shoot his hand away from this cup of water as soon as he touches it because it's so hot. So let's have a look in a bit more detail at exactly what is going on. So first of all, we have our receptor. We have a receptor, sensory receptor, and that will be joined to the sensory neuron. So this represents the sensory neuron. Okay? So sensory neuron. Okay. So the receptor is obviously in his finger, and the sensory neuron is now taking that impulse to the central nervous system. So let's just say that this is the central nervous system. So the sensory neuron has arrived at the central nervous system, and it will meet what is known as a relay neuron. So this here is the relay neuron. Now remember, the CNS is the spinal cord and the brain. And this has come in, the CNS is actually split up into white matter and grey matter. You don't need to know too much about it, but the grey matter is where the majority of the neurons are, the most important ones anyway. And here, this is inside the grey matter. So, we have a sensory neuron which has reached the relay neuron. This here is of course a synapse. So that there is a synapse. Anytime you have two neurons connected, we have a synapse. The relay neuron is just like in a relay race. It's passing the baton, and the baton in this case is the impulse to the motor neuron. And the motor neuron will carry the message back. So this is your motor neuron. Motor neuron carrying the message back. And this will carry to the muscles in the arm and the hand, and that will cause a response, which will be his hand moving away. So your direction of impulse is going to be from here, through the sensory neuron, across the synapse to the relay neuron. Relay neuron then sends it back via the motor neuron, and you'll then have your effector. Then have the effector here, which causes a response. Okay. Now, important to note is, let's say that the conscious part of your brain here has been bypassed. Your conscious part of your brain will still be, informed, if you like, that this has gone on. So that's why you can still feel the pain after your hand has already moved. The point here is that the conscious part of your brain is not involved in making your hand move. Your hand has moved without you thinking about it, but obviously your conscious part of your brain knows that the action has happened. That's because the signal is sent to the conscious part of your brain, but that will be slower than just using the reflex arc. So it's very important in terms of surviving and protecting yourself against damage, and this is how it works. Okay, so I hope that's made sense. If you do have any questions, please do comment in the box below or send me an email using the link, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.